All right. Okay. So we've hit 11 o'clock. We'll probably kick off. Well, we'll just kick off on time because we've got a lot of ground to cover today. Just first of all, hello. Thank you for joining us today. The webinar's topic is Fabric, so Microsoft's new sort of data and analytics platform, and I'll start walking through the presentation from here. So just to introduce the speakers today, so I've got myself, I'm James Beresford, CEO of Talos, and a veteran of the Microsoft BI ecosystem for over 20 years, and my co-speaker is Dean Wright. He's our enterprise Power BI lead, and he's led many Power BI projects to success, and is a key architect of our Pebble methodology for the consistent and successful delivery of those projects. So as a quick overview, here's what you can expect from today's session. I'll kick off with a very quick introduction to Talos. Then I'll get into an overview of Fabric, looking at its purpose, its history, and what I think is the biggest innovation, OneLake. Dean will then demonstrate an end-to-end scenario on the Fabric platform, so you can see exactly how it can work for you. And then I'll close out with some brief implementation considerations before we move into an open Q&A. Please ask your questions or pose your questions through the chat. There's someone in the chat called Please Ping Me with questions. If you send those questions through there, we'll then answer those at the end of the session. So as a quick brief introduction to Talos, Talos helps customers achieve efficient decision-making through automation and analytics. And for us, efficient decision-making means putting the right data into the right hands at the right time. We are Microsoft data and AI solution partners, and we deliver our analytics solutions primarily through Azure and Power BI, and obviously going forward into the future through Fabric. And our automation processes are delivered through Power Platform components, or for larger use cases, we use the UiPath technology platform. We have three core services. Enterprise Power BI, which is probably going to get renamed to Enterprise Fabric fairly soon. And that's really about ensuring organizations deliver impactful and used solutions on Power BI. So not just the technical build, but also all the change management and training to ensure what gets built, gets used, and actually drives change within an org. We also work on modern data platforms, so organizing and structuring data for consumption by downstream analytics platforms, such as Power BI and Fabric. And we primarily use Databricks, ADLS Gen 2, and SQL to deliver those solutions. And our automation initiation service line is really about helping clients getting started on their process automation journey. But as that's not overly relevant today, I won't dig any further. So getting into the Fabric overview. So what we're going to be looking at is four key topics. First of all, what the purpose of Fabric is and who is it for. We're going to look at how it's evolved from Synapse and Power BI, and that's quite important for some of the context of some of the features. OneLake, which I think is probably the most significant new feature in Fabric, at least for now, and also importantly, what licensing and cost implementations look like. So where will we start with Fabric? Fabric is a software as a service or SaaS implementation of a complete analytics ecosystem. So what it aims to do is provide all the tools that you need to conduct analytics workloads, from data ingestion through to advanced analytics, under that one platform. The SaaS approach is trying to make this as frictionless as possible. So the idea is that you just go into Fabric, sign in, and start using the tools with no need to configure or integrate them. The graphic on screen displays really the core concept. Fabric is a SaaS data analytics product underpinned by OneLake as the data store. OneLake is a big topic that warrants more detail, so we'll be revisiting that later. But worth noting in the platform itself as well, there's lots of references to Synapse on this screen, but they're actually dropped within the platform. But I'll stick with them for now because that really aligns with the documentation. So if you're doing any research post this webinar, then those are the terms you'll want to search for. So Fabric brings together all of Microsoft's data services under one interface. Data integration, and I'm going to just hop from left to right here. Data integration includes Azure Data Factory and data flows, which are backed by Power Query and are basically the same as data flows as they stand in the Power BI service currently. Synapse data engineering includes things like Spark processing through notebooks and also through building lakehouses. And Dean will be demonstrating building a lakehouse later. Synapse data warehousing presents a more traditional data warehousing experience through either SQL endpoints into those lakehouses or into a more traditional SQL style warehouse. The SQL endpoints are read-only, so a lakehouse is kind of a really read-only concept from that estate. But SQL warehouses behave exactly the same as a standard database. They kind of function similar to Power BI data marts, but add some additional capabilities around loading and data management. Synapse Data Science at the moment is primarily a Spark notebook-based machine learning experience. And Synapse Real-Time Analytics uses Custo query language for querying logs and similar streaming sources. And Event Stream also is kind of one of the tool sets within Azure that can capture that data, stream it into those Custo databases, and then be consumed by the service. Power BI obviously delivers the reporting and the data visualization components, and OneLake underpins all this as the primary data storage engine. Data governance and discovery is covered by Purview, but for now it remains as a separate platform. Because Purview is starting to get into that information management, into classification and security side of things, it's kind of leaning more into the Azure 365 thing. So it's kind of really part of the M365 platform rather than part of Fabric, but the connection between the two will probably tighten up over time. Features that are in the pipeline that aren't on this screen, but that are basically yet to be placed into preview, are Data Activator and Copilot. So Data Activator is a new feature that allows you to connect to your data sets, define action conditions, such as a KPI breaching a threshold, and then drive an action such as an alert or a Power Automate flow. So that's going to be really useful in terms of actually automating database decisions within your platforms. Copilot is a natural language AI assistant within the Fabric service, and that's going to provide capability with everything from building reports, and that was demonstrated at Inspire earlier this year, through to building data flows. So there's going to be a lot of capability that's going to be baked into Copilot, but again, that hasn't escaped into public preview, so we don't really have a good grasp on those at the moment. So first of all, one important piece of context in this whole thing is understanding the journey from Synapse through into Fabric. So in December 2020, Azure Synapse was released as your one-stop shop for analytics. And we ran some analytics in a day sessions that kind of walked through those end-to-end scenarios in Synapse, starting with the data source and ending up with a Power BI report. Less than 3 years later, in July 2023, Fabric has been released as your one-stop shop for analytics. And it contains many Synapse features, though with some modifications. So is Fabric Synapse v2, or is it just rebranded? Officially, Microsoft says no. Synapse is here to stay. Fabric is a new way of delivering all analytics capabilities in Azure under a simplified implementation. In my opinion, that's not going to last. Synapse wasn't a massive success in the same way that Power BI was. And so changing Power BI from something that sits under Synapse to Synapse that is something that sits under Fabric, which is very much Power BI led, makes sense purely from a product marketing perspective. There's also a lot of lessons learned from Microsoft's side. Synapse was expensive right out of the box, and it was not simple to configure. Fabric's got a lower cost entry point, and we'll cover that in the licensing session, and it's got vastly simplified configuration. So it's starting to make Synapse look like a legacy product. I would also suspect that longer term, Fabric is going to replace Power BI as the primary delivery approach when Microsoft are talking about data and analytics. But again, and I think, offers like Power BI Premium will merge with Fabric longer term, but, this is purely speculation on my part. So now we're going to focus on OneLake, which is what I think is the biggest innovation in this platform. So it's called the OneDrive for data. And the most obvious way that this surfaces is you can connect to OneLake in Windows Explorer, just like you can connect to OneDrive in Windows Explorer. And Dean will be demonstrating that in the technical walkthrough. OneLake is the single storage layer for all data in Fabric. So this is mostly a physical layer, i.e. the data is stored in Fabric attached storage. However, it can also be a virtual layer where shortcuts point to other storage, such as your existing ADLS Gen 2 based LakeHouse, or even external sources such as Amazon S3 buckets. So this allows for what's called a data virtualization type architecture, where data can be managed and stored in multiple locations, but is presented as a single layer through a tool such as Fabric. This means if you have data stored elsewhere, you don't need an ATL layer to bring it into Fabric. You literally just point at that data source as is. So data stored in the Fabric attached storage has a key benefit in that there is no additional compute cost associated with it. We'll cover this more when we get to licensing, but basically the amount of data you store is independent of the Fabric capacity you acquire. Fabric storage is basically ADLS Gen 2, and at this pricing point, pricing is TBA, but we can expect it to be similar. And there is going to be a certain amount of free storage attached to Fabric capacities, but again, this is TBA. And I think this is partly a response to Snowflake. So Snowflake's obviously one of its big sells is its separated compute and storage, and this is Microsoft's answer to that particular approach. An important note around how data is stored is that by default, Fabric uses the Delta Parquet format. So this is a widely used open source format, which has pretty much become the default for data lakes. For those unfamiliar with it, Delta Parquet stores its metadata in the file, so the schema is part of the file itself, hence schema on read for this kind of application. But what it also does is it allows for tracking for changes in individual records, hence the Delta part of the name. What this means for organizations that already have a data lake in the Delta Parquet format is that Fabric can plug directly into the existing lake with no changes required. Importantly, as the underpinning technology is ADLS Gen 2, it will accept any data format. So logs, CSVs, images, it doesn't have to be Delta Parquet. So regardless of the format, Power BI can connect directly to OneLake and query it data as is using what's called a direct lake connection. So again, no need to import and refresh data if you've got a constantly changing data source underneath. Power BI effectively has a live connection through to the data lake. And initial reports on performance are very promising. It's fast and can actually be equivalent to a database connection. So it's not going to suffer from sort of query lags when you have a direct versus an import mode. One thing to bear in mind, though, is that for direct lake is that row-level security does not yet exist for direct lake connections. Security is either allowed or denied. So if you do have things like row-level security requirements, import mode is the only option for now. But again, I think there's a high chance that that's going to change in the near future. So licensing and how much it costs is kind of a pretty critical topic. So licensing for Fabric is fairly straightforward. The basic model is that you buy Fabric capacity that covers the cost of compute across all workloads. So that means Power BI, Data Factory, machine learning, it's all bundled under one compute category. And that works in a similar model to Power BI capacities, although as you can see from the table, it does start cheaper than the smallest P1 Power BI premium capacity. So the lowest cost that you've got available is like a $5,000 a month, a year kind of pricing at the very, very entry level. As I mentioned, you do pay for the OneLake capacity, storage capacity separately, and you will get a certain amount of included data, but pricing and how much included storage is still not confirmed yet. The other thing to note is these are all pay-as-you-go prices. Reserved capacity is coming. It's just supposed to be within the next couple of months. November is the date that Microsoft's talking to at the moment, and that will have a significant impact on the costs of this platform because PAYG is always significantly more expensive than reserved instances. How this all intertwines with Power BI licensing as well is interesting. At the moment, Microsoft is saying that a Power BI premium P1 capacity gives you all the capability of an F64 Fabric capacity. Despite this, the F64 SKU costing about double what a P1 SKU costs. So I'm not entirely sure how this is going to track out long term, as it disincentivizes purchasing Fabric, as you can get Power BI premium for half the cost and get equivalent capability. So I'm going to be expecting some changes in that space soon. Individual Power BI licenses are not required in an organization to view content on an F64 capacity or higher. Power BI free becomes Fabric free with no changes in the restrictions around sharing content and so on. Power BI Pro also remains unchanged. no Fabric capacity capabilities are added into Power BI Pro, but you still need a Power BI Pro license to publish Power BI content in Fabric. And Power BI Premium per user also remains unchanged. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Dean, who's going to run through a demo of an end-to-end scenario and some of the features of Fabric. So Dean, over to you, and I'll just run.
Can we go back one slide?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, James, and good morning, everyone. So what we're hoping to be able to show is obviously, based off of even what James just described, Fabric contains a lot of information and a lot of different avenues to be able to interact with the data to be able to get to an end result. So what we wanted to try and do is be able to capture a demonstration that goes from starting with a completely blank Power BI Premium workspace that has Fabric enabled to then moving into creating a lakehouse, where we will then start to populate that lakehouse with some CSV files from the AdventureWorks database or data set from Microsoft that they distribute. We'll then convert those tables convert the files to tables inside the lakehouse. So we can do that through a couple of different options, through the GUI, as well as also utilizing the notebooks using the Python scripts. We'll start to interact with the lakehouse using a SQL endpoint that gets created by default. And as James said, that's the read-only capacity for that SQL endpoint for the lakehouse. We'll be able to create a Power BI data set from that lakehouse directly within Fabric, utilizing the views and tables that we are going to instill into the lakehouse. We'll make the data model using the relationships and using like the native Power BI desktop relationship modeling structure. Also then go through creating a measure and also a simple Power BI report. And then we'll also be able to test some of the functionality of being able to have that direct lake connection with the Power BI model. So we'll also then look back and ingest some new tables, connect those, and then add those fields to the Power BI report as well. And then we'll finish the demonstration with being able to actually see what it looks like inside Windows Explorer as well, to get a look and feel of it being the OneDrive of data. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll go through the demonstration. So we have a blank Fabric enabled workspace here. And so what we want to do, we can just go straight up to the top and go new lakehouse. So as soon as we give it a name, we have a lakehouse that's populated in a couple of seconds. And we can see here that once we want to start actually loading some files, we can load in a whole folder, and it says, do we want to load in all 28 files? We can do so, and it does all of those files in around about 20 to 30 seconds, obviously depending on the size of the files and your internet capacity, but it is really quite quick. Through a simple refresh, we'll be able to see that we can see those AdventureWorks data and those files there, all the CSV that are available to it. Has the demo stopped for anyone else? Yeah. Okay, there we go. Then what we can go from the files is that we can then load the file into a table through the GUI by just right-clicking on the individual file, giving it a name, and telling it where to go. Now that process can be quite long, but we can see that it happened in about 20 seconds. We did speed this up a little bit, but we have to do them all one at a time. What you can actually do is, if you wish, if you feel comfortable enough with any kind of Python language or other languages available to you, we can utilize a notebook here where we can then say that we want to ingest each individual file inside our lakehouse and convert them to a table and giving them a naming structure that we wish. Using the GUI, we can't actually have camel case, we can only have lowercase, but we can see here that when we loaded it through the notebooks, we could start to add all the files in a naming convention that we prefer. So then now that we have all of our files converted to tables, we can now get access to our SQL endpoint, of which we can then now start interacting with the data and doing a little bit of data cleansing and data transformation if we wish as well, getting it kind of ready for our Power BI data set. So by default, it goes into our DBO schema. Utilizing this, you can create some additional schemas as well using the SQL queries. You can also then start doing a default data model here as well, if you want to do it for the whole lakehouse, or eventually what we will do, we'll segment it into individual sections. You can also get a SQL connection string if you want to be able to utilize that for Power BI desktop, as well as also SQL Server Management Studio if you want to deal with it inside there, or you can just keep going through it through Fabric. So now if we go back to the query, we're going to create 2 views. We want to create a view for our dim date table, so that's a little bit more palatable to what it is that we're looking for. And just by copying and pasting the view across into this, we can now run this view and we create a view available to us inside the LakeHouse. If you do just rather than worrying, and this is utilizing the T-SQL commands, if you do not want to create the view as such as what it says in here, and you actually just do a normal query, you can just click on the Save as View button as well, and that will do the same process. I think it stopped again. Yep, there we go. And then so we can see that it's populated into the My Queries, and now we're going to do our internet sales as well. And we can say create view, run this, and we can now see on the left-hand side we have 2 different views stored in the My Queries. What we want to do now is actually move it to the Move to Shared Queries option. This means that if ever we do share this LakeHouse with other people, that they can access those queries as well. So if you do have common sets of queries that you want to run more frequently, you can do so there, and other people can now utilize that. And now if we go back to our LakeHouse view, we will be able to see that we can now click on the new Power BI data set from here. We've got our 2 views at the bottom, and now we're going to add some more dimension tables that we've converted to tables from our files. So we've got some product and also some customer data. And now we can click on the create a new Power BI data set. And this takes a few seconds to be able to fire up. And once it's there, now we're into our, if you've used Power BI Desktop before, into a similar kind of approach for our data model section for Power BI. And we can now start to look at creating our relationships and creating our star schema here. But one thing to note is once you do make a Power BI data set, by default, it will just name it the name of the LakeHouse with a number, depending on what it is. This is our first iteration of the data set. So once you finish your data model, always make sure that you go and save it with a new name, which we will do in a section. We'll fast forward to our completed star schema. And now we want to make sure that we can change our name just at the top by putting it in there. And we're going to call this our internet sales data set here, so that we can reference that whenever we want to moving forward. We can also, if we wish, add extra tables at different intervals if we wish to, but at the moment, we're just going to keep it as is. One of the benefits of Fabric is within this space, we can say we just want to build a new report now directly off of this. But before we do that, we want to create some measures as well. So we're going to create a total sales measure so that we can actually start visualizing the data that we have inside our fact table. And if you wanted to do any of the other kind of measures, you can do so within that space. The only limitation is you have no Power Query options available to you, so you have to do it all within DAX here. But if you do want to do any kind of transformations, you would want to use the Dataflow 2 version inside the LakeHouse to be able to bring the data in that way and do your transformations there. So we can create a simple report. We've got some product information, but we've also realized that we want to do some investigations by country. So now that we've realized that we've missed the table, we're going to add in our geography table to our internet sales from our LakeHouse. We want to make sure that we link it to the customer table so that we can then start to filter by our geography or by our countries. And so with a quick couple of clicks, we can now add it back. We can go back to our report and it's immediately there. Once we click refresh, the geography table appears immediately for us. So now we can add some further information available to us as well. We're only doing a very simple report, so a couple of matrices and a time-based approach at the top. And so now we can see total sales by each country. And as we can see, we've got a direct lake connection and it's relatively responsive. We want to give it a name so that we can store it within our workspace. So we can always change which workspace we want to put it in, but for our purposes, we want to put it inside our Fabric test environment. And now we can start to interact with the data like we would with a normal Power BI online report as well, which is really quite handy. We can then go back straight into the workspace and see that all of our artifacts are created in here. We can see our default LakeHouse approach here as what we can see. We can see all the underlying LakeHouses there, or the default LakeHouse data set as well. Look at the different subset data sets that we have here, and we can see what is upstream or downstream. So we have the upstream of the LakeHouse and the downstream of the report, and we can then go into that individual internet sales data model here and make any adjustments. What we can see now is utilizing the OneLake Explorer, much like what you have with your OneDrive, is that you have a folder files format here that we can see. So we can see all the tables that are underlying there, and then also be able to see the different Delta files and everything inside our LakeHouse. Sorry. And so we can see that we can start to actually visualize the data in there. And if you do have a lot of files on your computer that you want to move across into that, you can use that as well to just drag and drop, and then you'll be able to see those within the Fabric Online environment as well. If we go next, James. So just a little bit of a recap of that demo. We went through quite a lot of information in that small 7-minute clip. But we can pull out from that is that the LakeHouses to create are really quite simple. As long as we're within a Power BI, a Fabric enabled workspace, we can create any of the artifacts that we wish. So we can just go through the GUI, click on LakeHouse, and now we've got one straight away in there. It only takes a couple of seconds to fire up that right there. We can then add those files through either utilizing the Windows Explorer version of your OneLake or directly inside Fabric. And then we can convert those files to tables utilizing either the GUI or the use of notebooks to be able to speed up that process as well. All LakeHouses by default will get a SQL endpoint, and that's a way to be able to start querying the data or be able to do some data cleansing work, or where you can build views, tables, or schemas as well within that space. And what's really important is, whilst we only touched on just ingesting CSV files, you can also add data pipelines or data flows in there as well, so that you can actually start doing some of the ETL processes before the data reaches your LakeHouse ready for your data set. You can actually do some of that pre-ETL work or within the LakeHouse as well, in quite a seamless manner. If you've been utilizing data pipelines before inside ADF, or even data flows as well within Power BI or other avenues as well, it's really quite a handy tool to be able to utilize within the LakeHouse environment. We can build a Power BI data set directly from the LakeHouse inside Fabric, so we can actually make a subset data set. So whilst our LakeHouse might have multiple different areas, we want to condense it down and make a data set specific to that. And we want to be able to make sure that if we do then want to utilize tables again across multiple different data sets, we're using it from the same source. So it's not, we don't need to worry about versioning or anything like that. It all comes from the exact same source there, which is security in knowing that all your data remains the same across the different reports. We can update the data model really and make changes to the data model with measures, calculated columns, relationships, or tables getting added or removed really quite easily. And those changes are immediate. But once you make those changes in that data model view, as soon as you click refresh at that report view, it will appear there immediately for you. So it is really quite handy to be able to have those quick changes to be able to see if whether or not you can build on your reporting capability by adding some extra data sets available to you. And then also we can view those files within the folder-like structure within Windows File Explorer. So if you are used to using that kind of method to be able to see what data exists within the LakeHouse in a file format or a file structure, you can do it that way. Or if ever you want to look at what kind of Parquet files are created from the transformation steps as well, you can do so accordingly. But that is the end of our demo. As we said, we're only scratching the surface with one use case. There's still plenty more to you that we can go through, but I hope that you are able to see the capacity and the capability of what Fabric can do, and being able to create an end-to-end process in a short amount of time as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Dean. And look, I think this demo has kind of shown you like the breadth of capability that's within Fabric, but B, kind of underpins why I'm saying OneLake is such a big deal. You know, creating a LakeHouse in a Delta Lake format is very, very simple. So now we're going to look at quickly before we jump into Q&A is just a few implementation considerations. So implementing Fabric in a greenfield environment will be a nice to have, but realistically, most enterprises will have an existing data environment to consider, and quite probably a substantial Power BI environment also. Bringing Fabric into the equation is going to require an assessment of which workloads belong on the platform, which should remain separate, and whether it's worth the cost of migrating any of the components between the different platforms. Estimating costs is going to be a significant challenge, and it will take a few implementations and some trial and error to start sizing it properly. Existing data platforms will fortunately be easy to leverage using shortcuts. For example, our standard pattern involves Databricks as an ETL tool with AWS Gen 2 Delta Lakes as the storage platform. And using Fabric in that model is just a matter of using a shortcut to point to the gold layer if you're following a medallion architecture. Governance is going to become even more complex than it currently is for Power BI. We've run a number of Power BI governance exercises for very significant organizations, and simply establishing that one platform properly can be a significant exercise for those organizations. Managing the broad feature set that's available in Fabric will pose its own challenges. We're actively working on updating our governance offerings to encompass this, and we'll make announcements of progress in that space as our understanding of the platform deepens. And obviously, when Microsoft's final position on some of these things become clear, because it is still in preview. Based on how the Power BI platform evolved since the introduction of Premium, we can expect that initially there's going to be a few feature gaps in terms of governance and control that will get filled in over time, meaning that there will potentially be some challenges for early adopters in properly managing the platform and the data on it. Also, deployment and adoption is going to be continue to be something that organizations will have to consider in depth. Getting self-service analytics through Power BI, which is fairly intuitive, still requires a combination of training, internal champions, and user groups. And with Fabric capabilities, the expectations for end users in terms of data literacy and technical skill is going to substantially increase. Given the general level of maturity in organizations in this space, significant education and training efforts are going to be needed if organizations want to maximize their return on their investment in data on this platform. Having said that, in terms of Talos's organizational goal of efficient decision-making and putting the right data in the right hands at the right time, Fabric is a fantastic enabler. So with that, we conclude the formal part of the presentation. We hope you found the session informative and given you a good view of what Fabric is offering to enhance your data and analytics capabilities. From here, we'll raise any questions raised in the chat as the session progresses, but feel free to add more if they're occurring to you now, and we'll do our best to answer them. If you have to drop off, we thank you for your time and attention. You can always reach out to us directly at info@talos.com.au. And also, we're just establishing the official Microsoft Fabric user group at the moment. And so as details of that are announced, we'll make sure you're all updated. So with that, I'll start looking at the questions that are coming through.
We have a question from Drew. And what are some of the use cases for being able to modify files directly from Object Explorer? But when would you expect to modify files directly?
So that might be if you're actually building something like as Dean demonstrated, a LakeHouse from your own data that you've got. So maybe you build up a collection of spreadsheets and CSVs and you want to just update those and get those into the Fabric ecosystem, then using OneLake in your Windows environment would be a good way for that. If you're in like a really industrial sort of data lakehouse type environment, you probably won't use that for looking at Delta Parquet files out of anything other than like debugging or curiosity. It's more for that sort of end user. We've captured the data in various different places and we want to build a lakehouse, and it's living on desktops, and dragging it to and from desktops is actually the most effective way of getting that data into the platform.
Okay. Yeah, we also have a question. Is Purview
part of Fabric? Not at this time. So as I mentioned earlier, it's getting intertwined with information protection. So it's protecting things like emails, documents, communication internally. So the reach of Purview is getting deeper into the Azure and M365 management space. There is still the data cataloging component, which at the moment is just pointing at Fabric and can read Fabric stuff. But what was initially announced was that Purview was part of it. that seems to have stepped out. So I don't think they've quite worked out how the integration is going to work for that.
All right. So far, that's questions that we have.
Okay. I've received a direct question as well. So what's the roadmap for Power BI embedded from a Fabric licensing perspective? Don't know is the short answer to that. I suspect that what I've been told from licensing so far is that if you've got, like, if you're using Fabric and you're using Power BI embedded capability, as long as you've got the right level SKU, that's still available. It's similar to within Power BI Premium. You've got a certain amount of embedded kind of capability available to you at the moment. And if I skip back to the licensing sheet, you can see that there's equivalent. So the EM1, EM2, EM3 SKUs do have equivalent Fabric SKU capability. But again, this is one of those areas that's not entirely clear at the moment. Okay, are there any more questions? Okay, so I've got another one. What's the compute indirect Lake query mode for Power BI? Is it analysis services or Spark? The short answer is it's just an under the hood connection within Power BI. You literally just say, I want a direct Lake connection, and you have it. How it's actually running that query under the hood isn't exposed to the end user.
All right, Jane. Yeah, we do have questions from Joe. We have data in Snowflake. Does it use Delta Parquet format storage?
No, Snowflake doesn't use Delta Parquet. I think it uses its own format. So if you're using Snowflake at the moment, the best option, and actually maybe Dean, I'll pass to this in terms of working with Snowflake and Power BI as it stands at the moment.
Yeah, if you want to use Power BI itself with Snowflake, there is a connector directly there that you can be able to utilize and visualize that data within that space. And I know that the even Snowflake querying is SQL-like, but it's not SQL 100% either. So you can query specific there and be able to connect directly from that space. But from what I understand, as James said, I'm not quite sure if they use Delta Parquet as their formatting. I think they use their own style or their own version of it.
Yeah, so if you want to bring Snowflake data into Fabric, you would at this moment. I don't think there's a connector in place that you'd be able to point OneLake at it. I suspect that's probably going to be on the roadmap. At this point, you probably have to extract data out into Fabric and then use it from there within the platform, unless your use case was just reporting, in which cases, we've done for a number of projects, you just point Power BI directly at Snowflake and use it as your data source. All right. I've got a further question around data lifecycle management. So dev, test, pre-prod, and prod for lakehouses, CI/CD, and source control. So for the Power BI side of things, you're obviously still going to have the, and I've now forgotten the name of the tooling, but the kind of the lifecycle management within Power BI. For the individual components, you're probably going to have to, that's probably a bit of a work in progress. So that's not clearly articulated any of the documentation. So and as one of Dean's demos showed, when you're using notebooks, you can connect to VS Code. You can probably hook that up into Visual Studio and into some of those source cases. But at this point, that kind of hasn't been very clearly answered by Microsoft, but it will be a big issue. And this is part of the reason why in our standard environment, we use Databricks and as the ETL platform, because you can manage that more effectively. How you're going to manage that with notebooks and how you manage the different environments within Fabric is a bit of an open question.
I might just
want to redirect the Snowflake question back. So inside Power BI, utilizing data flows, you can directly bring Snowflake data into Fabric that way, into a lakehouse or anything like that you wish. So you can, if you do want to be able to move into, you're still using Snowflake as your base and then moving it into Fabric, you can use the data flow connector that exists for Snowflake to bring it into the lakehouse as well.
We have another question. Can Purview already scan Fabric workspaces? Would you expect lineage to be available?
Lineage, yeah. So yeah, the short answer is yes. Fabric can read anything in Fabric, and in a similar model to the way that it can read, like, for example, Power BI stuff at the moment. So that hasn't changed. It's just that Purview doesn't seem to be falling under the Fabric umbrella at the moment.
All right. And lastly, here on my side, can the OneLake sit inside the organization's VNet and work with private endpoints?
It's provided as software as a service. So OneLake is just kind of sitting within the Fabric platform. So how that it's not really kind of, it's not like you own the data lake in the same way. That might be addressed within the detailed configuration of Fabric. I'd have to take that one on notice. I haven't seen an answer to that at the moment.
Yeah, so far that's all the questions.
Okay, we'll give it another minute or two if you want to pop questions through. Otherwise, we'll wrap. As I said before,
I do have a direct question around the data flow connector
okay.
in Snowflake to bring data into the Lakehouse. Am I paying twice for storage? Yes, potentially. I'm not quite sure whether or not the shortcut option actually works with Snowflake. That might be something that may move down the way rather than so that you can connect to it and have it as just like read-only data rather than storing it within there. The storage may stay in Snowflake, but at the current present time, it would be needing to ingest into the Lakehouse. So potentially, yes, you would be paying twice. It just depends on how your processes will work, or whether or not Fabric becomes the ideal. If you want to move down that way, then potentially moving that process over to Fabric, or sticking with the existing structure as well, would probably be on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Dean. Okay, so as I was saying, feel free to reach out to us at info@talos.com.au. A link to book a meeting with myself is also available within the chat, and we'll send some follow-up emails to you to make sure that you've got all those things noted. Okay, one more thing. So I just had a quick question around whether you can try a composite model to implement row-level security in Direct Lake. That would be one mechanism that you could do it. But as I said, you could, the RLS, the security access to OneLake is on or off. So you would have to use an import or a composite model, which would work as kind of like I guess kind of like a proxy for having like a row-level security on the Direct Lake itself. But you can't implement that security at the lake level. You still have to implement it at the Power BI level. All right. Well, thanks everybody for your time. We'll be in touch again shortly after this. You'll get access to a recording of this webinar. As I said, contact us. You can either book a meeting with me directly. You can email us at info@talos.com.au, or you can reach out to us over LinkedIn or any other of the channels that are available. Thank you again for your time. We will also update you about the user group, so hopefully we'll be able to see you there in the near future. And with that, I believe it's a wrap. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.